Here we are. So welcome and thank you for joining Audubon Rockies and Colorado Healthy Headwaters Working Group and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment for a technical webinar exploring how House Bill 1379, Colorado's new dredge and fill permit program, and Senate Bill 270, projects to restore the natural stream systems, how they affect the legal requirements for stream restoration projects. I am Abby Burke. I am the Senior Manager of Audubon's Western Rivers Program and a chair of the Colorado Healthy Headwaters Working Group and your webinar host today. I'm a previous restoration practitioner, and today my work focuses on bringing people together to improve the resilience of rivers and streams for the benefit of people and birds, aligning policy and resources to support conservation and restoration projects, and stream restoration project management. I'd like to thank our presenters today for sharing about the overlap and alignment between Senate Bill 270 and stream restoration and House Bill 1379 and Colorado's new dredge and fill permit program, and the implications of the rulemaking procedures, as restoration practitioners need to be aware of both of these laws for stream and wetlands work. With that, I'd like to ask my co-presenters to say hello and introduce themselves. Annette, could I turn it to you first?
Sure. I'm Annette Quill. I'm with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment's Water Quality Control Division, and I'm a senior policy advisor with the division who assisted with this bill that we're going to be discussing today.
Great. Thank you, Annette. Kelly, would you mind going next?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelly Morgan. I'm also with the Water Quality Control Division. I'm in our Clean Water program, and I manage our compliance and enforcement section that will house our new dredge and fill program.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. Jackie, how about you next, please?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jackie Corday. I'm here in Montrose, Colorado. I'm a land and water conservation lawyer and work kind of at the intersection of policy and science.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Nathan.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nathan Bory-Recklin. I'm the Western River Specialist with Audubon, and I will be monitoring the Q&A, the chat, and dropping in links for you all as we go through the webinar this morning.
Terrific. Thank you. And thank you, Nathan, for your assistance with the webinar platform and chat today and all of that. Again, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar as we prepare to dive in for the smoothness of webinar function and accessibilities. Attendees have been muted and video sharing has also been disabled to kind of preserve our connectivity since we had over 135 registrants for today's session. We will hold our question and answer session after our presentation today. So please do add your questions in the chat at any time, and we will be facilitating that Q&A session again at the conclusion. Our presentation will conclude close to around noon today with Q&A following that. So running until about 12:15. And so again, just thank you for joining us today. Nathan, let's go ahead and pull up CDPHE's slide deck. And all right, I think with that, we are ready to jump in. Annette and Kelly, the presentation is yours when Nathan has the screen shared there.
Great. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Happy to share an overview of our state's new dredge and fill legislation. Nathan, I think you can skip past that slide. And we've already done introductions, but I'm, again, overview of, next slide, please. Overview of the bill. So I'm going to discuss the bill in general terms, whereas Jackie will focus more on stream restoration aspects, but I just kind of wanted to give folks an idea of what the bill is intended to do and kind of the structure of the bill, just so you have some context about what we worked on during last legislative session and what we're working to implement now. Go ahead, Nathan. So the bill was signed into law May 30th of this year, and it was effective July 1st. The intent of the bill, of course, is to restore protection of our state waters from impacts of dredge and fill activities that were in place prior to the Supreme Court's decision in Sackett v. EPA, which was decided in May of 2023. And as many of you know, the court defined WOTUS, Waters of the United States, as relatively permanent water bodies and wetlands that have a continuous surface connection to those relatively permanent waters. Of course, because of our climate and topography, some estimates are as high as 70%, but we typically, rely on, a very safe, conservative, approximately 50% of Colorado's streams and wetlands no longer have federal protection under the Clean Water Act. So Colorado acted quickly and was the first state in the nation to enact legislation in response to the Sackett decision. The new law protects all state waters that are no longer protected under Sackett, which I'll refer to sometimes in this presentation as non-WOTUS state waters. And I'll note that Colorado has always had the authority to protect our state waters in the context of Section 402. And so we haven't been subject to that back and forth in the WOTUS definition, but now it's been extended to dredge and fill activities as well. So the definition of state waters is there on the slide. I won't read it to you, but one thing that was added in this legislation is wetlands. While we at CDPHE have always considered wetlands to be state waters, we decided that this might be a good time to expressly put that in the definition of state waters. So we included wetlands as well. All right. And I'll also note, while the scope of protection under this new statute is very broad, all state waters, the bill also contains a number of exclusions for certain types of water bodies and exemptions for certain types of activities. And these are mostly derived from the federal program, but we also added some additional ones and a lot of clarity in those exemptions and exclusions. Next slide, please. So this is a diagram that some people find helpful. It took me a while to understand it, so I'm going to try to explain it to you. This is, simply, a visual showing how the definition of WOTUS has changed throughout the years in relation to state waters. So of course, the first circle is, this broad state waters, encompasses everything in the state, including groundwater. It's been in place since 1966. I should have probably included another little circle in here to talk about in 2001, of course, the Swank decision came out, which excluded from WOTUS anything that is not adjacent to other waters. So that, in other words, isolated waters. And so that was, kind of the first real narrowing we saw of the definition of WOTUS, since it had been in place since 1972 at least. But if you go to the second circle, then this shows the Rapanos decision, and the decision, of course, that came up with the significant nexus test. And while, state waters are still encompassed within that green circle, that there's this gap that you see where the blue circle extends beyond the green circle. And that is our state waters that go beyond the scope of federal WOTUS after the Rapanos decision. So we were, just to note, the state had accepted this level of protection in its dredge and fill program, knowing that like thin blue circle still wasn't protected. It was satisfactory, not optimal, but satisfactory to us. But then you look finally at the last circle, and that yellow in the third circle shows the continued narrowing of the scope of WOTUS with the Sackett decision in 2023. So now only about half, maybe more, of our state waters aren't protected. And the green and blue show what is now protected through this legislation. So it's everything. It circles back to the blue circle. Everything's protected, but in the third diagram, the yellow is all that's protected under the federal scheme. All right, next slide. And so why is this important? As I'm sure everybody here knows, these are just the purposes that our wetlands and our seasonal streams serve. Everything's connected. We know this as a scientific fact, and Colorado decided, to kind of put our money where its mouth is and, protect all these waters for all these important purposes. Next slide, please. So this slide just shows the main components of House Bill 24-1379. It gives, it's essentially two sets of responsibilities. And the first is for the Water Quality Control Division. And they are the agency that is actually going to implement the law by issuing individual and general authorizations and notices of coverage under those authorizations. This also includes the transition period that we're in right now before rules are actually adopted by the Water Quality Control Commission. Kelly will talk a little bit more about this interim time that we're in and things that we're doing right now to implement the program. And so the second set of responsibilities that the bill gives is to the Water Quality Control Commission. And they are authorized and indeed, they have to adopt rules by December 31st of 2025 for specific topics that are defined in the bill. And these are all going to be housed in a new regulation, number 87. And I think this might be a good time to talk about what a control regulation is and why we call these authorizations instead of permits. This is the regulations under Reg 87 that the Commission will be adopting are adopted under Section 25.8.205 of the Water Quality Control Act. And these are state-only regulations that are all designed to kind of fill gaps where the federal government doesn't regulate. And thus we aren't subject to federal oversight like we are, for instance, with the Section 402 NPDES program. And that's why we don't call these permits, because under these control regulations, other examples are biosolids, reclaimed water. We call what we issue authorizations to kind of distinguish those from our federally delegated permitting program. So I know that it's still taking me a while to get used to this authorization terminology, but hopefully, I don't know, I think at some point we'll probably use it interchangeably with permit, but officially they're going to be known as authorizations. Next slide, please. So this slide just simply shows that, kind of the respective duties of the commission and the division. They are both bodies that are housed within the Department of Public Health and Environment, separate from the Department of Natural Resources. There's obviously a health side, an environmental side, and the Water Quality Control Division administers the water quality and drinking water programs in the state. Whereas the commission is the one that establishes the rule. And I won't go through all those. I just kind of wanted to put something up to show what each of those bodies does. But importantly, the division is going to be coming up with a draft proposal for Regulation 87 for the Commission to consider in its rulemaking in December of 2025. All right. So now I'm going to hand it over to Kelly Morgan, who's going to talk a bit about the Water Quality Control Division's implementation of the bill.
Great. Thanks, Annette. Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly again, and I'm going to talk a little bit about implementation and what the bill requirements are going to look like on the ground. So as Annette mentioned, the division and the commission have until December 2025 to develop regulations for how Colorado will issue these authorizations for dredge and fill activities. But in the meantime, the bill directs us to issue temporary authorizations, which will be starting to issue beginning 2025. These temporary authorizations are somewhat of a stopgap measure to allow projects to proceed until the control regulation is developed and gives some more clarity on terms and conditions that will be required in authorizations moving forward. And we recognize and appreciate the need for some consistency between core, historic core permitting practices and what folks and practitioners are used to. So we are going to recognize terms and conditions of nationwide and regional general permits beginning January 2025. Those will be incorporated into the temporary authorizations that we will be issuing. And then next, the bill directs us, you can go back one slide, please, Nathan. Yeah, and then we'll also, in the meantime, be developing statewide general authorizations for discharges to isolated state waters. Isolated state waters are defined in the bill. Our primary focus initially will be to issue these temporary authorizations. We recognize the need for projects to move forward quickly, and we have a 45-day timeline to issue temporary authorizations for projects that would qualify for authorization. Next slide, please. So this pictograph kind of describes or demonstrates an overview of the requirements of the bill and how we're implementing it. So up until January 2025, and I'll take a step back and say beginning in August 2023, the division developed Clean Water Policy 17. Which was a policy acknowledging the need for projects to move forward, and in an effort to protect water quality in the interim until some legislation was passed. So then, beginning in January 2025, we will be issuing these temporary authorizations for projects that require pre-construction notification. And then when there are certain impact thresholds, which I'll get into later, that are triggered, then the authorizations will require compensatory mitigation. And then beginning in February 2026, when regulation number 87 becomes effective, that projects that require compensatory mitigation will be subject to regulation 87 requirements, and those compensatory mitigation requirements will be developed and clarified through the rulemaking process. Another big change will be our authorization to issue individual authorizations similar to individual permits that the Corps issues. And we'll also be issuing Colorado general authorizations. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, kind of our interim solution to the loss of protection of state waters that occurred after the Sackett decision was to develop Clean Water Policy 17, which is an enforcement policy, acknowledging that any discharges to state waters without a permit is not allowed under the Water Quality Control Act. But what we did was allow for this policy to allow projects to move forward under certain protective conditions. So as long as the projects met these protective conditions, then they were allowed to proceed under the policy. The projects, as you'll see, they must comply with protective conditions of the policy. Those include certain loss thresholds and requirement that project proponents operate and comply with a 404 permit that would have applied to the project. Again, minimize adverse effects and allows for the Water Quality Control Division to inspect the project. I'll note that since August of 2023, we have received about approximately 30 notifications. So any project that wants to proceed under Clean Water Policy 17 is required to notify our division of that project, and then we evaluate the project ourselves. We've received 30 notifications, anticipate that, or assume that that's actually probably a fairly low number. And there are a variety of projects that were submitted to us, but the main categories were transportation, commercial and residential development, and stream restoration projects. Next slide, please. So getting into the temporary authorizations that we touched on earlier, these will become effective for use January 1, 2025. They'll be limited to a 2-year effective term. And again, this is the interim solution until Regulation 87 is promulgated. The temporary authorizations will require compliance with core nationwide and regional general permit conditions, and they'll also include Colorado-specific requirements. So, the bill provided some clarity and kind of outlined these temporary authorization requirements, and we recognize the need for regulatory certainty moving forward. And so until regulations are developed, these temporary authorizations will be in place. The temporary authorization will set some clear expectations and provide project proponents with guidelines for compliance. We're in the process of developing application materials and guidance documents to go alongside of the temporary authorization. So I encourage you to visit our website routinely as those documents are developed. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, that we all recognize various core nationwide and regional general permits to cover dredge and fill activities. So rather than developing our own general permits at this point in time, we're going to use the core framework and core nationwide and regional general permit conditions to kind of drive water quality protection. And then after Regulation 87 becomes effective, then we'll begin issuing our own general authorizations, but recognizing the need for some consistency with what project proponents are used to, we're going to use core nationwide and regional general permits as templates for our own general authorizations. Next slide, please. So getting into some of the general authorization, the bill explicitly calls out a requirement that we developed a general authorization for isolated state waters. This will be a 5-year general authorization. Again, incorporate best practices for environmental protection, and they will not be used for projects that exceed these thresholds for unavoidable impact that you'll see on the screen here. Again, as Annette mentioned previously, it will exclude specific waters from coverage. Those exemptions and exclusions are outlined in the bill and will likely be refined further through the regulatory development process. Next slide, please. We will be requiring compensatory mitigation for all individual and general authorizations for projects that exceed those unavoidable impacts that you'll see on our screen here. And compensatory mitigation, similar to what project proponents and practitioners are used to, will address all functions of state waters impacted by the dredge and fill activity. And next slide, please. We'll pass that over to Annette to talk further about Regulation 87 development.
Great. I just have a couple of slides here. I'll try to move through this, keep us on time. I'll be talking about, the framework and the process for developing Reg 87. But this slide shows what the bill established in terms of the Commission's authority to promulgate regulations. There's essentially 3 categories of rules that the Commission needs to establish. The first is the rules governing the program as a whole. And again, based on that federal concept of avoidance, minimization, and mitigation, using those 404B1 guidelines, which will likely be incorporated by reference into the regulation. The second category is rules governing individual authorizations, and these are, would correspond with, any project that doesn't fit under one of the nationwide or regional permits would need to get an individual authorization. We want to try to take this opportunity to streamline some of the criteria for the application and try to make the process run smoothly. And then thirdly, compensatory mitigation rules. And we think that there's a unique opportunity here to think creatively and improve on the federal framework when it comes to compensatory mitigation. So those, again, are the 3 categories of rules that we're going to be proposing to the Commission for adoption in December of 2025. Next slide, please. And so this, I want to go through with folks because this is how people can get involved. We have a pretty robust stakeholder process underway, kicked off our first of many monthly stakeholder meetings on September 4th. So that orange section is everything that we're trying to do here yet in 2024. Again, monthly stakeholder meetings, which are all those dates along the top of the bar. And then we're also going to we're doing presentations at the different basin roundtables during this time to try to get the word out about our stakeholder process. December 4th. I'll back up. Mitigation workshops. We already had a wetlands mitigation workshop, and we are still next week. At the end of the week, we're going to have our stream mitigation workshop, and I'll tell you how to sign up for that if you're interested. But again, as you'll see, going into 2025, we hope to have a draft reg ready at the end of this year in December, and then would be, kind of diving in and really discussing it in detail and getting feedback on that at our January meeting, which is towards the end of January. We'll continue to have monthly meetings. We'll take feedback at those meetings, and we'll have opportunities for written feedback as well. The actual formal rulemaking process before the Commission won't start until August of 2025. And that's when the public notice goes out for the rulemaking. And, it's kind of a more formal process of pre-hearing statements, that kind of thing. But our stakeholder meetings will continue through that time as well. Okay, next slide, please. And I'll finish off with this one, but I think Jackie is going to come back to it as well. This is the website that contains all the information that you'll need about signing up for meetings, signing up to get emails, you know, and you know, of course, it's a work in progress with this being a new program, but I think it's off to a good start. All the meeting materials and recordings of meetings will also be included there, and it's fairly user friendly. So that's all I have, and I will turn it over to Jackie unless you want us to answer questions now.
Annette, well, thank you very much. Kelly and Annette, thank you so much. We're going to hold questions at the very end. And so I did pop it into the chat for everybody who's attending. Please put your questions in and let us know what your questions are. And at the end of our time after Jackie and myself present, then we will be looking at that Q&A. So please do pop your questions in when you're ready. So thank you again. I will go ahead and take it over, and Jackie, I will have you on deck here in just a few moments. So again, thanks Annette and Kelly for setting such a great stage, and also thank you for having such a robust and well-organized engagement process. So it's really been extraordinary. So congratulations to you and your team for creating such a great hub of information and engagement. So thank you. All right, so for now, Jackie and I are going to be covering three things in our presentation. One, a very short review of the highlights of Senate Bill 270 and the training we gave to help translate that new law to projects on the ground, to share with you the Senate Bill 270 training manual that we prepared, and then we'll be spending the bulk of our time kind of looking at House Bill 1379, and our focus is on the provisions relevant to stream and wetlands restoration and kind of comparing the two bills. And we'll have many resources for you. So going forward, I think it takes, you know, it's good to remind ourselves where we started here with Senate Bill 270. And so as you can recall, Senate Bill 270 was a dynamic and it was a very successful effort led by Department of Natural Resources, particularly Kelly Romero-Heaney, then Assistant Director of Water Policy for DNR, who had been in a point role in bringing multiple sectors of the water community together for this legislative fix aimed at providing greater certainty for stream restoration proponents. And it's always important to kind of review some of the intent of Senate Bill 270, and that can be found in the declarations. But just to paraphrase, and then I wanted to provide a quote, Coloradans benefit tremendously from healthy, functioning rivers. And in the declaration page, a myriad of benefits were mentioned, such as flood safety, water quality, wildfire mitigation and recovery, recreation, of course, riparian and aquatic habitats. But it's most importantly, and this is quotes, that the General Assembly therefore declares that because of the vast amount of benefits that natural streams provide to the state's communities and environment, the state should facilitate and encourage the commencement of projects that restore the environmental health and natural stream systems. Next slide, please. So because there were so many dynamic changes and really a spirited discussion around Senate Bill 270 during the 2023 legislative session, after it became law, we created a training to build confidence on how to move stream restoration projects forward under the new law and provide best management practices, whether you are working within or outside of Senate Bill 270's criteria. We received incredibly helpful reviews and input from both Department of Natural Resources and the Division of Water Resources leadership and dozens of attendees, which were incorporated into the training PowerPoint and manual. We even had the opportunity to present the Senate Bill 270 training to over 60 of Division of Water Resources staff, including top leadership. Next slide, please. As this slide's transitioning, I wanted to let folks know we created a training manual to capture the core of the 3-hour in-person training, which we debuted at our June Stream Restoration Workshop. The workshop was built off of the many requests and needs for state and federal agencies, to NGOs and watershed groups working in or wanting to work in stream restoration projects while respecting water rights. If you like, you can review the presentation and extended sources of information on the workshop webpage. And so we'll pop that workshop resources list here in the chat for you. And thanks, Nathan, for popping in the manual. Next slide. So the chart from the manual that you see highlights the streamlined and kind of core content of Senate Bill 270. The rows that are highlighted in green are where you will find low-tech process-based stream restoration practices. Next slide, please. In addition to breaking down Senate Bill 270's content, some of the most important information is actually contained in the suggested best management practices for stream restoration projects. And so we have a standalone 4-pager that actually encompasses many of these best management practices, and we'll pop that in the chat. Thank you, Nathan, very much. And so there's a lot of information, and we know a lot of you have been engaged in this information along the way. We have the resources in the chat, and we have additional resources if you have further questions around Senate Bill 270, but we really want to kind of work into this nexus of where Senate Bill 270 and House Bill 1379 come together. So with that, let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Jackie.
Thanks, Abby. And so this is the last slide that we have on SB 270, and it just kind of wraps up the whole point of SB 270 was to figure out a path forward for stream restoration projects without them being subject to water rights administration, having to get a water right. And so this is what you get. If your project does follow the criteria for where you're working, because it's different for perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral streams, then your stream restoration, if it complies with those criteria, it does not cause material injury to any vested water right and is not an unnecessary obstruction. And we explain that a lot more in the training, but just wanted to make sure we included that. So next slide, please. Okay, some of these things were covered by Annette, but I will highlight a few things that maybe not, I can't remember if Annette, you talked about the whole program focuses on avoidance first and foremost, then minimization of impacts to wetlands and streams, and then compensatory mitigation of unavoidable adverse impacts. So that was a really important aspect of the bill. Also that no new commission was formed. And there is a long list of permit exemptions, 13, and excluded water. So it's a state water, but it's excluded under the legislation. There's 11 of them. And so they include all of the existing federal exemptions and exclusions, plus more that were tailored to Colorado stakeholders who weighed in on the bill. Okay, next slide. So what I'm going to focus on over these next 15 minutes is the 6 provisions in that bill that are most relevant to stream wetlands restoration work. 4 of those 6 things require rulemaking. So the very first one that requires rulemaking is a provision right out of the bill. They must adopt a rule that exempts from state permitting voluntary stream restoration efforts in ephemeral streams that do not require compensatory mitigation and are designed solely to provide ecological lift. There's some key words and definitions that were provided for those words in the legislation. So ephemeral stream, you see there's a definition right out of the bill. And what is ecological lift? Again, that was provided in the bill. So those are 2 important things to understand. We're going to go into this particular provision a little bit more, but that's your introduction to this exemption. And as Annette explained, this is not in effect yet, but it will come into effect once there's a rule adopted that fleshes it out some more. That will happen during the rulemaking process. Okay, next slide. So for many of you on this call, you are probably familiar with ZEDIC rock work, but maybe not all of you are. And that's really one of the things that exemption was getting at. This work has been going on in Colorado for over 10 years, especially on the west slope. And it's just doing incredible things to help stop these awful erosional head cuts that eat up these beautiful rangeland wet meadow areas that are so important for birds, wildlife, and livestock. And so you can see there's different types of structures that are put in depending on how far is that erosional head cut down. This is the kind of thing that exemption will allow this work to continue to move forward without having to get an authorization. As you know, ephemeral streams are not a WOTUS. I don't know if they ever have been a WOTUS. They certainly haven't been for any time that I've been familiar with it. So you haven't had to get an Army Corps permit to do this kind of work previously. So that exemption that was in the bill now says you won't have to get a state authorization either once that is developed through the rulemaking process for this type of work. Next slide. Just more pictures of this incredible work. Especially want to give a shout out to Sean Connor, who Audubon and myself have been working with from Biologic. He's here in Montrose. This is the kind of incredible work that we're talking about that would fit that exemption. And there's a great technical note. If you wanted to find out more about this work, you could Google that title, Hand-Built Structures for Restoring Degraded Meadows in Sagebrush Rangelands. That is a great technical paper that shows you all of the different types of structures. Next slide. And one last project that Abby and I had the privilege to go and see in Western Colorado, where in August of 2021, there they are. They've just installed the Zedic rock structure to stop that erosion and drying up the meadow above it. 2 years later, that you can't even see the rock structure anymore, but you can see the incredible growth that has resulted and been restored. Those native grasses and sedges and plants based on that work. Next slide. Okay, so now we're going to go into more of the provisions that are relevant to restoration that were in the bill. First thing, and Annette and Kelly have already discussed this. The division must develop statewide and regional general authorizations that correspond with the various nationwide and regional permits issued by the Corps. This will include the nationwide 27 for restoration, enhancement, and establishment activities. And so lots of you on this call may be familiar with the nationwide 27. And that will apply to streams and wetlands that are no longer considered WOTUS. The state one permit authorization will apply to, as Annette said, non-WOTUS state waters. And this will occur sometime in 2026, as Annette explained what the focus is for the next year in 2025 is. Number 3, the bill allows the division to create additional general authorizations to achieve greater efficiency and address Colorado's specific needs. And they gave examples in the bill, including but not limited to emergency response to wildfire and voluntary ecological restoration. So this is something to stay up to date on and participate in the rulemaking process. Again, as I understand from Annette, this wouldn't happen until 2026, but there will be opportunities for the public to participate in that. And that's something that Abby and I will definitely be tracking. And there's an opportunity there to develop a general authorization that would apply to more than just ephemeral voluntary restoration. Okay, next slide. Okay, the fourth relevant provision is the isolated wetlands. And as Annette explained, the bill directs the division to issue a statewide general authorization for discharges to isolated state waters. And then the bill defines isolated state waters to include isolated wetlands and isolated ponds and impoundments. Next slide. But the bill also provides other really key provisions that you need to pay attention to. The general authorization does not apply to fens, peatlands, cattle ponds, all of which are defined in the bill, and projects impacting wetlands over 1/10 of an acre or 3/100 of an acre of stream bed. And so this is language that we cut and paste right out of the bill explaining that. Okay, next slide. All right, so the fifth relevant provision is that projects that require a 404 permit, and again in parens kind of WOTUS, which is for all WOTUS, and WOTUS equals all perennial streams, intermittent streams that have relatively permanent waters, and wetlands having a continuous service connection to relatively permanent waters. We sent you a PowerPoint that was done by the EPA that really did a great job on explaining WOTUS, including relatively permanent waters. So please refer to that if you want to dive deeper on understanding where we at with WOTUS after SACIT and all the other things that have happened in updating the federal rules around that. So the typical Army Corps permit obtained for stream restoration projects, again, is the nationwide 27. And in Colorado, you'll see, I just grabbed the title from the latest, most current nationwide 27 permit, and it was updated in 2022, in February 22, and it doesn't expire until March of 2026. So there's a 5-year period that nationwide permits are effective, and they have to be updated every 5 years. So in Colorado, this one's good through March of 2026. We also popped in there a map of the Army Corps offices. You can see there's 4 of them in Colorado in 2 districts, the Omaha district and the Albuquerque district. And Nathan just popped into the chat for you a really great PowerPoint that the Army Corps of Engineers staff gave at our June Carbondale workshop. So if you want to know more and take a deeper dive on nationwide 27 permits, that's a really great resource to click on and look at it at another time. Okay, next slide. So other relevant provision. All right, we're on the 6th relevant provision, and that really has to do with the ordinary high water mark. And that has been defined in Colorado water statutes for a long time, for decades. And there is the statutory citation right there. But the bill included a provision to further define how it can be determined by physical characteristics. And it lists 6 factors that are straight out of the Army Corps of Engineers Ordinary High Watermark Delineation Manual, which the next slide talks about that a little bit more. So what the bill did was it just added to that Colorado statute some of those characteristics. How do you delineate it? So in the relevance to SB, going back to SB 270, so if you're working in a perennial stream, any type of structure that you place in the stream for restoration purposes, whether that's a post-assisted log structure, a beaver dam analog, large woody debris, J-hooks, cross veins, any type of structure, if you're trying to get that exemption to not being subject to water administration, because remember, it's voluntary, it's not a requirement that your project adhere to the criteria. But if you're trying to go for those criteria and you're working in a perennial stream, then your project must not cause the water level to exceed the ordinary high water mark. And the next slide kind of helps. This is a slide that we had in our SB 270 training. What is it? It's defined, as I mentioned, in Colorado water law, but this manual from the Corps is really kind of the Bible for how do you go and delineate it out in the field. And you see the criteria listed in the white there in those bullets. That is the new criteria for Colorado that was adopted in HB 1379. It was added to Colorado law. But again, these criteria have been around for decades in various versions of the Army Corps delineation manuals. The latest one here was November 2022. I understand that's going to get updated again, might come out sometime in 2025. Next slide, please. And this is also from our SB 270 training. This is also from the Corps manual. And we found that these graphics were some of the most helpful graphics to trying to understand what is the ordinary high water mark. And it's the high flows that you're looking for, the average over a course of years. And in Colorado, that sometimes can be maybe 5 years in some places, maybe 10, depending on what type of stream you're working in. Intermittence, it might take more average of years to figure out where that ordinary high water mark is. So it's not extreme flows, it's not moderate or low. So it's this color band right here, which often includes, in some systems, the adjacent wetlands in riverine environment, the riverscape, as we often call it now. Okay, next slide. And this is one other important point from the Army Corps of Engineers manual. It is not a static line and can change over both time and space. It often does. It can be the river can become more incised and the ordinary high watermark chases down that incision, or it can be graded after a big post-fire debris flow. Abby and I have seen that a lot lately on a site that we're working on. A stream can be completely upgraded and brought back up to reconnection of the floodplain by just massive debris flows that come down. Okay, next slide. So the last couple of slides are just to help you with a chart of trying to put this all together at a high level in one place. And this recording is going to be shared out with folks, so you will be able to have access to both these PowerPoints in the recording. So don't worry if you don't get all of this down. But essentially, this is a kind of maybe an easy way to think about this. For dredge and fill permits for voluntary restoration for streams and their contiguous riverine wetlands, is where are you working? If you're working in ephemeral stream, for instance, you are not going to need a federal permit because it's not a WOTUS. That's always been the case, as far as I'm aware of, for quite a few decades. But now, under the new legislation, will you need a state permit? Well, generally not. If you are working, it's a voluntary project, not required for compensatory mitigation, designed solely for ecological lift, as we talked about in the previous slide. So that's kind of maintaining the status quo. You didn't need a federal 404, nationwide 27 permit. You won't need a state one once those rules are adopted. But it's not determined yet whether or not you're going to need to give the division notice. That is still something that will be worked out in the rulemaking process. Now, for intermittent, the answer for do you need a federal permit? It's a maybe, right? It depends on if the area you're working in meets the relatively permanent waters test. So if a federal permit is required for where you're working, then you won't need that state authorization as well, as we explained in a previous slide, because that was right in the legislation. If your project is wholly covered by a federal permit, you're not going to need an additional state permit. But if you're working in an area that is WOTUS and needs a permit, and non-WOTUS state waters, you will need to check with the division to see if you need a permit for that. It's possible that a general authorization may apply, or an exemption or an exclusion, but if not, you're going to need a permit. And then again, with perennial, usually perennial streams, you're almost always going to need a nationwide 27. And then for non-WOTUS wetlands, that is non-contiguous and isolated wetlands. And as Annette showed in her graph early on in her PowerPoint, that's a pretty good size area in Colorado because we have so many intermittent streams and isolated wetlands. So for all natural wetlands that are state waters, you will likely need either the general authorization or an individual, depending on your project and the size of your impact. So that's something to continue to be aware of, and as the rulemaking comes through, if you're working in these kind of areas, make sure you're checking with the division on that. Next slide. And the last slide that I was going to go over is just a comparison, a really brief high-level comparison between the two pieces of legislation. What is the agency that's you'll need to be in contact with that is in charge of administering this? So for HB 1379, it's CDPHE, the Water Quality Control Commission and the division. For SB 270, it's DWR. They administer water rights. They do not issue a permit for, as we explained, for SB 270, but we do encourage communication with them and talking to them about your project to make sure you lower your risk of impacting any water rights. And then the overlap for restoration projects is essentially that project managers and practitioners need to be aware of both laws now. They work in tandem in that they're both applicable to many stream restoration projects. And so you need to determine if a state dredge and fill authorization is needed for your project. And for SB 270, you need to understand how to apply the criteria to your project's location and design before installation, and checking that it complies after, if that is your choice you're making, that you do want to comply with that law to not have to be subject to water rights administration. All right, Abby.
Thank you, Jackie. And I really feel that that last statement, that project managers and practitioners need to be aware of both laws, going forward. That's really our take home today. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for amazing presentations. I just want to underscore some of the engagement opportunities and resources that Annette and Kelly had referenced in the beginning. The rulemaking process began on September 4th for House Bill 1379. I'm going to pop this website into the chat.
Abby, we lost you. You
muted
mute.
yourself.
There you go.
Thank you very much. Well, if I wasn't saying before, what a glowing thanks for outstanding presentations, Annette, Kelly, Jackie. And I wanted to echo some of the information here that Annette and Kelly had mentioned at the beginning of our presentation about how to engage, how to find out more. The link is in the chat for you to just click on and become as aware and engaged as you would like going forward. Annette and Kelly had mentioned about the compensatory mitigation workshops. The wetlands was September 13th. Upcoming just next week, streams compensatory mitigation workshop on October 4th, 1 to 4 p.m. And as Jackie had also mentioned, we will make sure that this recording for the webinar is posted on our Healthy Headwaters Working Group page so that you'll have this as a reference. Let's go ahead to the next slide. And so please do add any questions to the chat while you are thinking about some great questions to ask our presenters. We want to make sure that you have this ability to sign up for our regular information sharing opportunities through the Colorado Healthy Headwaters Working Group, hosting webinars, workshops, timely updates on places that engage here in the riverscape restoration space. So you can easily hover over that QR code with your phone and sign up if you're not already on our e-list, where we have a new newsletter quarterly going out with opportunities for engagement going forward.